Hello. You want to learn how to start a podcast? Great. Let's get started. My name is Connor Kifachin, and I am a comedian and content creator who edits podcasts. Podcasting is extremely popular. As of April 2020, there are more than 1 million podcasts and 30 million podcast episodes. It's exciting to start a podcast, but I'd argue it's more exciting to start a successful podcast. In 2018, Dan Misener, the head of audience development at Pacific Content, found that 12% of podcasts have only published a single episode. 6% haven't made it past 2 episodes. And half of all podcasts have 14 episodes or fewer. In addition to that information, Misener found that the most popular podcasts have a common trait. They have a lot of episodes. So with that in mind, if you're new to podcasting, here are my 6 tips on how to start a successful podcast. Number 1, idea generation. Idea generation. It seems kind of intuitive and not an exciting first step. However, growing a successful podcast starts with a great idea and something you're passionate about. Speaking for myself, I know if I don't love a project that I'm working on, I'm not likely to follow through, and I just tend to let it go. When generating an idea for a podcast, a lot of people just think, well, I'm just going to talk. And while some people do that phenomenally, I would suggest when idea generating for podcasts, you look for a hook and a niche. Having a niche for your podcast will help provide you with a focus, and it will help your audience find you, and you in turn find your audience. Having a hook will help you know what information you should share within your niche, and it'll help you draw in a really specific audience for your show. A hook is really part of that value that you are bringing to your audience. Having a niche and a hook will not only help you thrive in your area of interest, it'll help you keep your focus narrow to help you sustain and grow your podcast. Number 2, thinking about equipment. A lot of YouTube videos that give advice on how to start a podcast start with equipment. While you need some equipment, you could actually start a podcast with just your phone and free editing software, and you're set. The audio quality may not be great, but you can make it work. I would advise you to invest in some equipment if you are serious about podcasting. However, advising you on the specifics of that equipment is tough because each individual has their own budget and their own interests. In a future video, I do want to go over what equipment would be helpful for you and review it, but what I would recommend right now is do not overthink equipment. When considering microphones, there are 2 types to consider: USB microphones and XLR microphones. The difference between USB and XLR microphones are the connections. USB microphones connect through a USB, and XLR microphones, you guessed it, connect through an XLR. The pros of a USB microphone is that you can just plug it into your computer, you're set to go. You don't need other equipment such as a mixer, and USB microphones are pretty cheap. The cons of USB microphones is that you don't have the richest sounding quality all the time. You don't have as reliable of a connection as XLR microphones, and you're limited to the number of guests or potential hosts that you can have to the number of USB inputs you have. The pros of XLR microphones is that you have a more reliable connection, usually better sounding audio quality, and these microphones will last if you take care of them. The cons of XLR microphones are that they are more expensive, and you do need to buy a mixer in order to get the recording off of wherever you're recording it from and onto your computer. My small piece of advice when considering buying equipment is invest in audio equipment that will last. My original podcast kit that I bought in 2016 had 2 dynamic broadcasting microphones, one of which is this one right here that I'm still using, and the other is still frequently used by my co-host when we record our podcast. Number 3, choose your editing software. Editing software is important to the podcast creating process. Depending on your podcast, editing software is where you may spend most of your time. Editing software is like equipment. It depends on your budget. There are a number of editing softwares that will help you do what you need to do. But here are 3 to consider. Number 1, Audacity. Audacity is a free editing software that you can download right now and get started right away. It's a little less intuitive than other softwares and doesn't have all the bells and whistles that'll help you get your sound to that next level. But if you're looking to grow as you go, this is a great place to start. Number 2, Reaper. Reaper by some is considered the lead editing software, and the price for an individual license isn't that expensive. As of today, June 3rd, 2020, you can get a Reaper license for $60. Getting that $60 license comes with stipulations, but if you don't qualify for the discounted $60 license, a Reaper license will still only cost you $225. Number 3, Adobe Audition. Adobe Audition is what I use when I edit podcasts. It's what I started out with when I started in radio. Adobe Audition you get in the Adobe Creative Suite, and the Adobe Creative Suite is pretty expensive. For an annual subscription, it costs $600. The pros of getting that subscription to the Adobe Creative Suite is you have an access to their entire host of suites, which includes Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, Premiere, and more. And what's nice is the applications are pretty compatible. So if you want to grow your podcast into video one day, you can go pretty seamlessly from Premiere, the video editing software, to Audition, and it's actually pretty intuitive. So that is something for your consideration. Number 4, recording. Now that you have your editing software, your equipment, and you have your idea fleshed out, it is time to record. I would argue if you're just starting out in podcasting, a good, clean recording is more important than the equipment you get. The best way to help your editing process and have a good quality product is having a good, clean recording. And just because you bought some expensive equipment doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get that good, clean sound that you want. A good recording means you have no background noise and no echoes. And echoes can come from having too big of a room, or you have glass walls because you're in a conference room, or there's a monitor or window on the other side of your mic. Also, something that's very important to audio recording is getting good levels. If you have a way to monitor your recording levels when you're recording a podcast, I aim to keep my recording levels between -12 and -6 dBs. But the real big thing that you want to avoid is peaking. Peaking is a distortion that can happen when you speak too loudly or have too loud of a sound going into your podcast. And that can happen because you have your gain up too high. But no matter how it happens, having peaking is really tough and almost impossible, if not impossible, to get out of your podcast. So there's no substitution for good, clean recording. All of that said, I would suggest having a recording checklist that you can run through before you start recording your podcast to make sure you get that good, clean sound. In that checklist, you should make sure that you're checking for any background noise potential issues, including notification sounds, that your recording levels are right, your room environment is not too echoey, and anything else that you can think of that could cause your audio quality to drop. In an upcoming video, I plan to share my recording checklist, so stay tuned for that. Number 5, editing. As an editor myself, I said it before and I'll say it again. Depending on your podcast, you may spend more time on editing software than anywhere else. Unless you're taking a live recording and just uploading that straight to wherever you're hosting your podcast, editing takes a lot of time. And different show types have different editing requirements. For instance, a podcast that you're just discussing or interviewing people is pretty easy, but if you're doing a creative show with a lot of sounds to mix in, that can take a lot of time. Things to notice when editing and cleaning audio include echoes, imbalances in levels for hosts and guests, and any background noises that may have crept into your recording. Notice almost everything I said in that list, and that's just, a partial list, is something that you may have been able to prevent by going through that recording checklist. And so that recording checklist will help you get that clean recording. For the actual time you can expect to edit, again, that'll depend on your type of podcast. From my own experience, editing straightforward interview or discussion podcast, my editing ratio is about 3-1. What that means is if I get an hour-long podcast to edit, I can be expecting to edit for about 3 hours. However, that ratio can really creep up to about like a 5-1, if not more ratio, if the recording is really bad. So that means, again, get that good, clean recording. Don't worry though, I've heard of people having a much lower editing to recording time ratio. I just tend to be really detail-oriented and diligent when it comes to editing a podcast. The overall takeaway is editing takes time. I've met some people that have tried audio editing and really just ended up hating it. But the only way to know if you enjoy editing audio, like I do, is by trying it out. As I said before, I am a podcast editor. And if you really don't like editing, or you just want more time to work on the creative elements of your podcast that go into recording and pre-production, you can reach out to me. I'm taking on new clients, and right now for new clients, the first episode that I edit for them, I'm offering a deal of 50% off. Number 6, releasing your podcast. You did it. You now have your podcast. You had your idea. You went through the gauntlet of editing. That wasn't so bad because you got that good, clean recording, and now you're ready to release. What you need to think about when releasing your podcast is where you want to host it. I know there are release strategies for having a big public release, and that's something I'll talk about in a different video. But really, if you're just starting out, again, the thing you need is just a place to host your podcast. Some places to consider hosting your podcast are Anchor, Libsyn, Blueberry, SoundCloud, and Buzzsprout. Having a host for your podcast means having a place for you to upload your audio so you can get an RSS feed that can be distributed to other podcast distributors. And that sounds like a lot of jargon because it is. What you should know is different hosting sites make it easier or more difficult to get your podcast onto other distribution platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The other thing to consider is whether or not your hosting site is going to charge you for their services. What I would recommend you do is do your research on those two elements, distribution and price, with wherever you're leaning. What I use for my podcast hosting is Anchor. I've had a really good experience with Anchor. Their customer service has been great, and they actually make it very easy for you to get your podcast onto all the major platforms. They also are owned by Spotify, so you know your podcast is going to get there, and they help you get advertisers. Advertisers is also another topic for a different video. But with all that said, everyone has their own opinion when it comes to podcast hosting sites. And if you want to, actually, I would appreciate it if you commented below if you have a different podcast hosting site than Anchor and you really love it and why you love it. Let's just help the community. One last thing when thinking about releasing your podcast is the day you want to release it. Some people might think you can just choose a hosting site and put it on the platform and it's everywhere. And that's just not true. Sometimes it takes multiple days to get your podcast onto major distribution platforms like Google Play and Apple Podcasts. Say you're planning to release your podcast on a Monday, but it actually takes 48 hours to get your podcast onto Apple Podcasts, which means people won't actually get it until Wednesday. If you've put your release date all over social media and it's not there where people can get it, that's not a really good release strategy. So what I would recommend, if you have a really specific release date in mind, is putting out a trailer and making sure that you get onto all the major distribution platforms before your release date. And if you still want to keep your podcast a secret and don't want to have anything out there before your release, you can take that trailer down. You just want to make sure that you are set to go for your release day. All right, that is it for 6 tips on how to start a podcast. I hope this was helpful for you. And if it was, I would appreciate a like and a subscription from you. A subscription, that sounds like I'm selling magazines. Remember, starting a successful podcast is a long-term project, so pick something you're passionate about. Please let me know if you have any other tips or think I missed something in the comments section, and feel free to reach out to me on social media or connect with me if you want someone to edit your podcast. My information, my website is in the description below, and I wish you all the best in starting your podcast. I cannot wait to see you at the top of the charts.